Okay, good morning. So I think we're ready to get started here. So I apologize for if those of you who are live on the Zoom link. We got kind of a late start because nothing was really working. Not the camera, not the projector, nothing really. Excuse me. So I think we're back to where we need to be. I had to get the guy from AV up here twice, and for whatever reason, somebody, as I thought, had messed with all the controls, and so this is where we sort of are. But so it's an abbreviated class session for those of you watching on the recorded Zoom YouTube video. You're going to see it's probably not an hour and 15 minutes, it's more like 55 minutes. And just because of the fact that we had some delays from really the minute I came in. So my apologies for that. But anyway, in any rush to get through this material, we've got plenty of time. It's early in the semester, it's 15 weeks. So we're not like one of the abbreviated courses of 7 weeks where we have to run like crazy. So real briefly, what we're going to do today is we're going to finish talking about chapter 6. And when I say finish, I guess I thought we'd maybe finish. I don't know if we will or not, but we'll do what we can to try to get through this. And what we don't get done, we'll get to for next week. And I intended to get probably most of next week. We'll talk about chapter 8 in the text, which deals with unemployment. And so it's obviously an important issue, something that is always on people's minds as to what's going on with the economy, how are jobs, what's the job market looking like. We'll give some current information on that and see where we are with that. And one of the great things about macro as opposed to maybe micro is the idea that a lot of this information is very, very current, and very much relates to what's going on in our lives. And so unemployment is one of those. And the week after chapter 9, inflation is going to be discussed. And inflation has been the big subject for a long time now, as inflation is higher now than what it's been in about 40 years, and it's still high, and the government's still trying to bring it down. And we'll talk about who is trying to do that, and we say talking about and what are they up to, and how is that working out. So we'll get to that, and we'll talk more about that in week 6, and I'll give you more visibility as to the exam, which is, the exams are roughly every 3 weeks, which it seems like it's fairly accelerated, but if there are no quizzes, there are no discussion activities, there are no papers, no group presentations. And so, and you could take these in Brightspace, which I think everyone did. I don't think anybody did it in this class as a paper version. I have another class in which some people just want to take paper exams. That's perfectly fine. Most people do not. So you've got the advantage of doing it at home or wherever you want to do it. So that's where we are. Other questions for me about anything? Anybody in the room or anybody Zoom call have any questions about what we're doing and where we're going, etc.? Okay, well, I want to come real briefly. And let's hope this is now working. I think it is. I want to talk about where we left off last time. We were talking about output and income. That is what we call GDP, and that's really the focus of this chapter, is gross domestic product. Remember what that term means, gross domestic product. It's the output of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. We say goods and services because they are, in fact, goods as well as they are services. And so they're both produced and accounted. And there's really interesting and I think excellent article in I think early on in chapter 6 about how the government collects all this data. And I sort of alluded to this in class on Tuesday, that really the heavy lifting in macro was done years and years ago by people who didn't have computers, they barely had telephones to connect people to find out, hey, what's going on? What are the surveys of businesses, purchasing surveys of purchasing managers in terms of what their inventory decisions were. And so today it's a lot easier because we have a lot more capability to collect this. But still, having said this, there's no giant computer capturing all this information in real time. And one of the things about macro, and it's a topic we come back to again and again, is the fact that pretty much all the information is historical, and which means that when it comes to advising economic policy, the metaphor is driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror. And this automotive metaphor comes up again and again in macro whenever we talk about policy. And remember, policy, whenever that term is used in macro, it's almost always government policy, because it's really only the government that has the ability to sort of manage and fine tune and tweak the economy, which it is pretty much doing on a constant basis. Okay, so where we left off last time, we were talking about one of the two approaches. This is just real brief real brief review is the expenditures approach, which we were into last time. We got as far as I in the calculation C plus I plus G plus or minus X sub N. And that is the demand side of the economy, And then we're going to get to the income approach. So let's pick it up from where we left off last time. And that was the expenditures approach. Okay, so let's do that. So real briefly, remember last time we talked about C. So the calculation, the expenditures approach, which is the demand side of the economy, is consumption plus investment plus government spending. And then it's plus or minus. Sometimes you see it as plus or minus net exports. And we'll talk about what these last two are here in a second. So we left off, we were talking about consumption. One thing we said about consumption was it's about 2/3 of GDP on a pretty routine basis. It's a little more. It's about 68, 69% of GDP. 2/3 would be 67%. So it's close. And we'll talk about what the significance is of that in terms of its relatively constant percentage, if you like, of GDP, total output of goods and services. We can't really put a similar percentage with any kind of predictability on investment because it's up and down, it's quite volatile, okay? What about government spending? So government spending is this. We've got really two main categories of spending. We've got federal spending and we've got state spending, okay? And in the United States, by our Constitution, we are more federal, meaning what? Meaning that we've got a federal government, and we've got which is basically an affiliation of states, and we have individual states. And what's interesting about this is, in the initial development of the Constitution, the idea was that the United States would be a federal republic in the sense that federalism meant a confederation of very strong states and a very weak federal government. In fact, the federal government was designed to be so weak that the president himself was considered to be a clerk. I know that sounds completely crazy and sounds unbelievable, but the idea was the president would basically sign documents and preside for, hence the name president, would preside for 4 years and then we'd go away and somebody else would come over and take over the role of executive branch clerk. The problem was that they were also named commander-in-chief of the Navy, which doesn't sound very much like a clerk. So there was lots and lots of compromise when our Constitution was created. This is one of the compromises, was federal and state. Today, I think most of us would agree that the federal government is much stronger than state governments. However, once we start getting into the numbers and start tearing into this, we're going to see that states collectively spend more. Remember, this is expenditures than does the federal government. So, which doesn't sound right because I think most of us think, okay, well, spending by government is done through tax dollars. And if you just look at your own taxes, you probably pay a lot more in federal taxes than you do in state taxes. I'm talking about income taxes. However, in reality, states raise a lot of money in different sorts of ways, like how, and that are a little more invisible than just filing a tax return. What are some of the ways states create income for themselves that is revenue? Sales taxes is one big way. Every time you buy something subject to sales tax, the state takes a piece of the action, much more state than federal. Even though there was some talk in Congress about trying to have a federal sales tax, I can tell you that's probably not going to go any place at all. Sales taxes are a function of state government. They're a big revenue raiser for states, okay? So today, I think the issue is the federal government is certainly more dominant in terms of its role in regulation, in terms of controlling the economy. The states still have a role to play, even though they've sort of given up some of the regulatory control. And states no longer have any kind of control over money issues. They barely have any kind of control over regulation of things like financial institutions. They used to. There used to be lots of state banks all over the place, and there still are, but not very many. It's mostly a federal government issue, but states still have a role to play. But let's talk about from a spending standpoint, what are we talking about? We've got two main categories of federal spending, and there is, and then basically it's this. It's defense and everything else. And so, and the reason we break this up into two categories, defense and everything else, which is non-defense, is the fact that the United States has a gigantic amount of spending on its military. And when we talk about the military budget, we're talking not just about the personnel, the hundreds of thousands of personnel who are active duty or are civilian employees, but also all the infrastructure that goes to support all the bases around the world, all the administration, all the material and whatnot. It's gigantic. And I remember that Colin Powell, who's a former Secretary of State and a former top military man, said that in terms of spending, and I like this metaphor that he gave, in terms of spending on defense, the United States was #1 in the world, and #2 is more like #10. That's how far out in front the United States is. And I know that for those who are critical of defense spending, and there are a lot of people, they think that maybe all this is doing is sort of amping up tensions with other countries. So then you have China sort of amping up its defense. Maybe they wouldn't do that if we didn't do ours, who didn't do the same in the United States. Others would say, well, if we don't do it, then China is a potential military adversary and whatnot. So this is an argument that depends on what you think about it. And it's not really our role here. I mean, certainly we could talk about defense spending and whether it's too high, too low, whatever, but it is what it is. Okay, so we break it into 2 categories. Now, we probably wouldn't do this for too many other countries in the world, perhaps but China, because of the large defense spending that both countries have. And China still lags the US in terms of its defense. But defense is not just military, it's also things like the intelligence budget is all dumped into that. And so it's a very big category. Non-defense is everything else at the federal level. So it's all the alphabet soup of agencies, you know, the DEA, the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, you name it. It goes on and on. That's all dumped in the second category here. And one thing that's not here, and it's an important thing to talk about, and it's something that we need to be clear, because politicians will very often misrepresent this, and they know they're doing it, being politicians, being what they are, and that is Social Security. Social Security does not add a single dollar to the US budget or to the US national debt, really off budget. And there are activities that are just simply taken off the budget funding. They don't receive any kind of support from Congress itself. They are funded by taxes. That's the case with Social Security and Medicare. But a lot of times people are talking about, hey, federal spending is too much, let's cut Social Security. And today we're hearing more and more of that kind of talk. Social Security does not add to this. It's a separate issue altogether. And and I know for a lot of people here, maybe Social Security is not something you're concerned about, but as you get older, it does become something that to consider, particularly the fact that there are threats on what to do about it. So just to be clear, as we get into the numbers, we'll show how that's not the case. What about state government? What do states spend money on? And what are the categories here? Well, first of all, what are states primarily responsible for and always have been, and what are their main functions, their main areas? And the big one here is probably public education. It's not the only one, certainly, but public education is really a function of state governments. It's only been really in the last few decades in which the federal government's had any kind of involvement at all. And they certainly took a bigger role after President George W. Bush took office in 2000, where they did a lot of things like No Child Left Behind, where the federal government got in public education. And to a lot of people's chagrin, because I think that a lot of people did not find that particular initiative to be helpful, public education is still really a function of state government. Okay? I only bring up the federal government involved because the federal government has primarily not been involved too much in public education. Even at our level here in higher education, which we're part of the CMM is state funded, and so as a result, we're a public entity in that regard. So public education is one. The second big category here is law enforcement. I know sometimes it seems like law enforcement is primarily a federal issue, but it's not really. Yes, all the TV shows have the FBI and it's really a function of state and local law enforcement has the primary responsibility for law enforcement. In terms of law enforcement officers, the court system, the prosecutors, the incarceration system, which is primarily a state function. Yes, the federal government has all of those things, but it's much smaller. It's primarily a state function, law enforcement, and always has been. So that kind of gives you an idea there. And then things like infrastructure, which the federal government also gets involved with, but we're talking here about streets and sewers and water systems and electrical systems. Infrastructure is a hard to define term, but I would really call it sort of the connective tissue of an economy. It's all those things that connect various unrelated parts of the economy together. Things like roads and streets and lighting and and docks and rail and all that. And some of this there's overlap with the federal government, no question about it. But primarily, the state government has lots of responsibility, particularly for things like streets and water systems, things which most of us don't think about too often on a daily basis, but which is good that we don't have to think about it because it's been done. So all this falls under this G category here of government spending. So you get C plus I plus G, and that constitutes the first three terms here in the breakdown of total demand throughout the economy. Okay. So C is consumption spending by households, I is investment spending by businesses, G is government spending by government, full federal and state government. And by the way, local government everywhere in the US is a subset of state government. So all local government sort of feeds into it. It's simply a subsection of state government, okay, with Bernalillo County or Albuquerque or Valencia County or whatever, okay? By the way, investment, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but I know sometimes people get confused by the term investment, which is over here now, and it's not financial investment like stocks and mutual funds and things like that. And this is confusing because we think of investment as being, okay, I'm going to put money into my IRA or 401k, and that's an investment. That's not what we're talking about in economics. We're talking here about investment in productive assets from businesses and only businesses. And so that's why we got into this breakdown of things like inventories and new construction and whatnot. Okay. All right. C plus I plus G. What's the final term here? And it's net exports. And so what is this? So this term is net exports. So a couple of definitions here as to what we're talking about here. Now, by the way, C plus I plus G is pretty well understood and used by most economists, and so is Y, the capital letter to be the break symbol for GDP. But this term here, sometimes you see all over the place. Sometimes you see it as NX, sometimes X sub N, like what I've got here. Sometimes you see it simply as X minus M, which is X stands for exports, M stands for imports. Now, here's the problem with this, and it'd be very nice if all economists could, in the macro realm, could agree on one symbol for everything, but M also stands for money. And so I kind of don't like to use this. And I can't recall offhand what your text has. I guess we can take a look. Does it represent as X sub N or NX or whatever? In any case, whatever the representation is, and I bring it up because a lot of people will look around on the internet for additional resources or whatever, or even have older versions of the text, and sometimes it changes, but it's always the same thing. It's exports minus imports. Exports minus imports. What are exports? These are goods sold to foreign buyers. Remember, we're taking a view of this economy from the US point of view, but it could be any economy. We just happen to be looking at it from the United States point of view. That is our government spending money on, or our society spending money on things, consumption, investment, in this case, net exports. Goods sold to foreign buyers, why does that go into GDP? Because it's part of spending. And what happens is, as we sell goods to foreign buyers from the United States, it means that buyers are then transferring money to us. Now, it could be in the form of yen or euro or pesos or whatever, and that somewhere along the transaction, they'll get converted to dollars, but nonetheless, it's an inflow of money, okay? Whereas imports are goods purchased from foreign sellers. And this is a definition that applies whatever economy you're talking about, goods purchased from foreign sellers. Okay, and all right, so let's talk about this because this is an area that is, I think, sometimes exaggerated in terms of its importance to the economy and lack of importance. And I'll point you to if I can pull it up on the screen here, I will. There's a great pie chart in your book that shows the percentage of, pie charts are nice because they're easy to sort of see. And you can sort of break into looking at the portions of total spending that are made up of these things. C is the biggest by far. I is really not that big. Frankly, it's pretty volatile, it's not that big. G is pretty significant. It's also fairly stable, but this is really small. This is like a little sliver of pie. It's not even a piece of pie, it's just a little sliver. But yet we hear a lot about it. And we hear lots of controversy, a lot of hubbub about exports and imports and whether or not trade with other countries is a good thing or a bad thing. Most economists will say it's a good thing because it allows buyers everywhere to have access to goods that they wouldn't have otherwise. Now, here's the thing about it. Every time we buy an import, we do end up hitting the brakes on the economy because we produce less income for the economy. But if we did not import goods, we wouldn't have things like bananas and diamonds, and gasoline would be, or would be more scarce. We'd have to drill more oil here. A lot of these goods that we simply don't produce here wouldn't be available. And even though we have lots of availability of goods here in the US because we produce them, even if we erected a big, hypothetical wall where nothing came in and nothing went out, we'd probably be okay, but we still wouldn't have access to a lot of the goods. And by the way, that would sort of make our standard of living sort of go down. It would also mean there's less competition from foreign buyers. And so domestic sellers would have the incentive to raise prices, wouldn't they? One thing that keeps prices relatively stable is foreign competition. And I'm talking about things like automobiles, right? I know there was a lot of concern over imported vehicles into this country. Beginning around the 1970s and through the 80s and 90s, it was the idea that US manufacturers of cars weren't keeping up with foreign rivals. And as a result, the Reagan administration in the 80s put quotas on the number of vehicles that come in from Japan. And the idea being, let's protect our domestic industry, because the American consumer kind of felt like these goods were a better fit for them. There was a feeling they were better quality, they were less expensive, more fuel efficient, all these kinds of things. And don't take my word for it, just look at the numbers. The demand for these vehicles went up, not just from Japan, but from other countries as well, South Korea, Germany, Italy, wherever. So as a result, sometimes governments try to put up controls to try to keep those goods out. Eventually, Japanese car makers got smart and started making vehicles in the US so that they were not technically imported goods. But every time we buy an imported good, we end up sort of hitting the negative sign on the economy. Every time we sell a good to foreign buyers, we end up putting a little bit of gas into the cylinder here, because it means that foreign buyers are financing our output income. And here we're financing the output income of foreign sellers, okay? And we'll talk about what the issues are with regard to this. The big issue here is the idea of the imbalance between the two. So if we're talking about X minus M, right, well, then we need to know that what is the difference? And so are exports greater than imports right now, or are imports greater than exports? So the answer is imports are greater than exports. And so as a result, this value here is negative. And so as a result, this term is negative. It has been for the better part of 60 years. There was a time in the early 90s in which it was positive for a very brief time. I think it was around 90, 91, negative for a very long time. Meaning that what? Meaning that we import more goods from other countries than what we export to other countries. So in other words, Americans are financing the output and income of foreigners to a greater extent than what foreigners are financing the output and income of domestic producers. Is that a big deal? Well, it's grown, it's become bigger over time, but it's not, I don't think, as big a deal as what some might talk about. When this is negative, okay, so when you've got a condition in which exports are less than imports, which is what we've got now, we call it a trade deficit. A trade deficit, and it has the effect of bringing down overall GDP. Simply because of the fact that it's what we call a leakage from the economy. And I'll write that down. It's a leakage. And this is going to be the first of a number of uses of this term leakage as a metaphor for something leaking out of our economy. In other words, income in this case, right? Where is it leaking off to? The rest of the world. And I realize that we trade, if we're talking about the US economy, we trade with, the 200 or so other countries in the world. We trade with almost all of them. There are very few that we don't do business with at all. Korea being one of them, Iran being another one that I can think of. And even with Iran, there's some, they do have some involvement in the oil market. But primarily those are, I can't think of too many other countries the US does not do business with, even where we have difficult relationships. Russia, there's not much trade going on now. Russia's been sort of walled off from the rest of the world because of concern of its actions in Ukraine. But for the most part, there's free trade throughout the world. And so when this happens, when any country runs a deficit where exports are less than its imports, there's a deficit, which brings down GDP, and it's what we call leakage. A leakage of what? A leakage of money, because we're measuring all these in dollar terms. Every term on this equation, left and right, is measured in dollar terms. And if and by the way, even though maybe we're looking at it unfairly as from a US perspective, if we're taking the Mexican economy, it'd be the same sort of relationship, and everything would be expressed in pesos. And the equation would be different, the dollar amounts would be different, or the peso figures would be different, but it's the same. Simply focusing on our economy since we're all here. Okay. All right. So that's the condition where exports are less than imports. What about in the case in which exports are greater than imports? We call them trade surplus. A trade surplus is where you have a positive effect on GDP. So GDP goes up, and we call that an injection. So this idea of injections and leakages will be used again and again, and it's sort of a never-ending progression and procession of these automotive metaphors that come up again and again to describe economic phenomena. It's an injection into the economy. So whenever an economy sells more abroad than what it takes in from abroad, it means it receives more dollars or yen or whatever from other countries than what it sends out, and so as a result, it's a boost to their economy. Now, the U.S. economy has been negative in this category for many, many decades. There were times in which we had a surplus, but for the most part, we've been running a deficit. A lot of it has had to do with oil over the years. That's becoming less and less of an issue. And as we become less dependent upon foreign imported oil, some of this is not really growing with the economy as a whole, which is why we don't hear quite as much about the trade deficits being an issue, okay, as what we did a few years ago, only a few years ago. So it's there, it's a negative every time and I don't mean to lay down a guilt trip, because every time we buy gas or buy bananas or whatever, yes, we're sort of hitting the brakes on the economy a little bit, but it's worth it because we have, at the same time, we have the goods to show for it. Now, there are some economies that have trade surpluses and have had it for year after year after year. And the two economies that come to mind here as being sort of the world champions of this are Germany and Japan. Germany in particular is a notable case in point where they've had a trade surplus year after year, and it's by design. The German economy was sort of designed around this idea of raising income from abroad by specializing in goods that the rest of the world wanted, especially things of a high-tech nature, machine goods, things with motors and things that move. They have a robust chemical industry, a pharmaceutical industry. In other words, they deliberately engaged in what we call industrial policy. And that is where the government has designed the economy around generating a surplus, which is an injection into their economy. And the same with Japan to a large extent as well. We don't have in the United States something called industrial policy because what that involves is government doing a lot of planning of this. But I bring it up only because this is around the world. If we were to have every trade surplus and every trade deficit in dollar terms, it would have to equal zero on the global stage because one country's deficit has to be some other country's surplus. And we're talking about the entire balance of all these, because with some countries we've got a surplus. With some countries we have a big deficit, okay? There are some countries in which we sell a heck of a lot more too than what they buy from us. And that's a good thing, but we end up buying more from some other countries than what we sell to them. So this is all on a net basis. And globally, it's all got to equal zero because it all has to balance. Deficits and surpluses will balance themselves out, okay? So that's the final term, net exports. And so if we come over here and talk about how this looks from the circular flow model, because I have said before that the circular flow model we're going to sort of build on and talk more about as we get going throughout the course. And so I've sort of recreated circular flow. I'm not going to do the red arrows here because remember the expenditures approach is simply measured in dollar terms. So let's just do the dollar flows here. So what do we got going on here? We've got households buying things from firms primarily. And so that's C, consumption spending. Okay. We've got firms buying things from other firms, and that's investment spending. This is a particular, excuse me, manifestation of the circular flow we haven't gotten into yet, okay? I've got asthma, I'm not sick, it's just asthma is also. So that's that. Now, what about government? Government also buys things from business firms. And so we've got G going on there. But also, doesn't government employ people? And so as a result, we've got G in the form of wages. And again, there are red arrows that go in the other direction, but I didn't want this to get too busy. So we can all focus on it and see what's going on here. These are simply the dollar flows. So households buying things from business firms primarily is consumption spending. And businesses engage in investment spending, buying things like vehicles and, inventory and things like that. So as a result, that's investment spending. And then we've got government involved in buying things from firms. And we know the government is a buyer of goods, just like the way that we are. And yes, some of the goods that government buys are unique. None of us would buy Apache helicopters or aircraft carriers or something like that. It just doesn't exist. It's a government buying monopoly, which we call a monopsony, which is simply a single buyer in the market. But the government is also the employer of wages. And I have not included in here Social Security, because it doesn't really add to GDP. If I get a Social Security check, which I am not eligible for yet, but one day I'll get that, that doesn't add to GDP because I'm not doing anything in exchange for that, simply a transfer. And we're going to get to transfers here in just a minute when we talk about the income approach. It doesn't really add to GDP, but it will translate to spending in the economy. And so it'll work its way into it because it is a transfer. Okay, so we've got C and I and G. And then what about the final category here? And that's net exports. And here you've got the spending, you've got export payments, money flowing in, and the red arrow would be goods going out, right? And then we've got import payments, which are good, which is money going out. This being now greater than that, because imports are greater than exports in our economy. So these are all dollar flows. If this is the US economy, these are all, or any economy, these are all dollar flows. And so money coming in, money going out. Money comes in from selling exports, and those economies in the world specialize and focus on exports will raise lots of money from abroad and be an inflow into the economy, whereas countries that import more as a leakage from the economy, it just goes out. Okay, so expansion of the circular flow model, and as busy as this looks, it would be even busier if we had included here the red arrows for the actual goods. But as I mentioned when we first created this model a few weeks ago, I said that we're going to be sort of adding bits and pieces to this over time as we talk more about different elements of the economy. Okay, so questions about that? All right, well, let me come back. I'm going to swivel back here. Before we get to the income approach here, I want to talk about one final thing here, and I've already sort of alluded to it, but I want to focus on a little bit more, and that's this. I want to talk about this notion of stability versus instability. So I'm going to erase all this here, and then I want to sort of talk about this idea of how it contributes to the economy in general, okay? So we've got consumption, and we've got investment, and we've got government spending, and we've got net exports. You're going to be sort of tired of hearing the C plus I plus G, but it really is something that is important. So what about consumption? We say that it's about 2/3 of GDP, and it's been a fairly consistent ratio over time. And so we're going to say that in terms of its contribution to GDP, because if one of these is going up on the right side, it's going to bring up the left side, right? Unless it's counterbalanced by some other term on the right side. It's just a math. It's just an addition problem. It's not a particularly complicated thing. So what about consumption and its overall contribution to the volatility in GDP? We're going to say that consumption spending, believe it or not, is very stable. It's very stable. And why is it very stable? Well, there are a lot of reasons why. And some of these we'll talk a bit more as we get going through the class. One is tax policy, adds to stability of the economy. That is, as the economy grows and incomes rise, people pay more taxes. Not only do they pay more dollars in taxes, but they pay a higher percentage in taxes. And that sort of slows the economy down. That's what we call bracket creep. And it's primarily at the individual level. Corporate taxes are mostly now not tiered, that is set up in tiers of brackets, but rather as a single flat rate. But as the economy grows, it slows the economy down with higher taxes. And as the economy falls, people are less income, pay less taxes. And so as a result, that adds a boost to the economy, plus the addition of transfers and whatnot. So we've got a lot of different ways by which we cushion the blow. And that's a good thing. Believe it or not, this is a good thing. And as people, I know that a lot of people would not probably feel like consumer spending is stable, but it is. So that part of consumption, GDP spending is stable. However, what about the I term here? It is considered to be very volatile. Very volatile. And by volatile, it's neither a negative or positive connotation. It just means it's up and it's down, it's up and it's down. And you can't even say it's X percentage of the economy because it's up and I mean, sometimes it's been low single digits, sometimes it's been as high as, high teens in terms of percentage of the economy. And the reason for this is mostly simple, and it's got to do, and I think somebody mentioned it last time, it's got to do with the little I, which is the interest rate. We'll talk a bit about this, and we're going to get to this a bit more later in the class about interest rates, because as we start talking about money and the money supply and all this, the interest rate becomes very important. And so, but what is the interest rate? Because it looks like when we say the interest rate, it wouldn't be inappropriate if you thought, well, what interest rate? We know that there's no one single interest rate out there. Mortgage interest rates are different than student loan interest rates. There are different car loan rates, different than credit card rates, savings rates, all that. And the answer is yes, that's true. And when we focus on one particular interest rate when we're doing modeling, we'll usually focus on the very shortest term and the very safest term of all. That's what we call the Fed funds rate, which just changed yesterday because the Federal Reserve, which is our monetary authority, adjusted it. Okay, but it's the interest rate there. The interest rate is simply this. It's the rental cost of money. I think I talked a bit about this on Tuesday. It's the rental cost of money expressed as an annual percentage. Okay, it's always expressed as annual percentage. Unlike loan sharks who will charge 1 or 2% per week or whatever they charge, it's not per week, it's always an annual percentage. So if you have a credit card that charges you 19%, it's 19% annualized. So it's the rental cost of money expressed as a percentage. So I is always a percentage. And here's the relationship between the little I and the big I. And that is this, and that is if rising. Meaning that it costs more to borrow money, it means the big I is going to fall. That's the relationship. And if the little I is falling, the big I will tend to rise. And so this is a relationship that looks a lot like the law of demand, doesn't it? The inverse relationship between one variable. In fact, we could put the interest rate on a vertical axis, the demand for investment on a horizontal axis, and it would be downward sloping. And we'll get to that a bit later, and we'll show that. And if you want me to do it, I can, but it just suffice to say it's downward sloping, but we sort of would know that if we know that if one thing goes up and the other thing goes down, there's an inverse relationship. And it's pretty obvious as to why, and that because what did we say that investment spending was composed of? Is it's composed of business investment in things like heavy equipment and machines and computer technology and facilities, of all kinds. It's also composed of new construction. And new construction here also includes residential construction, because even if you were to buy a house, that's a secondary sale. The house itself is built by a business, and new construction is very sensitive to interest rates. And so right now, what do we see going on in the economy? Interest rates are rising pretty rapidly, and new construction has pretty much been grinding to a halt for anybody who's looking for new sources of funds, because the rate of interest keeps going up. And we just heard yesterday from the Federal Reserve Chairman that rates are going to continue to go up for some time. In order to do what? To slow the economy down. Because if we slow down at least this portion of the economy, which is very volatile, goes to, maybe even falls, and it brings down GDP. Now, you might be saying, why on earth would the government ever want to lower GDP? Isn't that the total pie that we're sharing amongst each other? Why would we want to bring it down? Well, there could be a time when the economy is growing too fast, and as a result, we've got inflation. And I think that's exactly what's been going on for at least the last year, if not year and a half, as we've come out of the pandemic. Time is going too quickly. And the evidence of that is the fact that we have a very low unemployment rate. 3.5% unemployment is thought to be not sustainable without inflation, because it means everybody who wants a job can probably find one, unless they're just unemployable for all kinds of reasons. And I know there are a lot of reasons why people who would otherwise be working cannot, for various issues. But for the most part, 3.5% is very low. Most economists believe that full employment, and we're going to talk much more about this next week, full employment somewhere around between 4 and 5%. Let's just call it 4.5% to sort of split the difference. Well, that's a whole percentage point of the labor force higher than where we actually are right now. So this is why the interest rate is going up, and this is why investment is going down, and we're starting to see this happen. I think we mentioned in class one day last week about some of the layoffs that were beginning to happen throughout the economy. We're starting to see it, particularly in the technology area. So to my main point here, if we're talking about the contribution of all of these terms to GDP, C is pretty stable, I is very volatile. G is mostly, government spending is mostly stable. It goes up over time, and that's to some people's consternation, but for the most part, it's relatively stable. Okay. And then what about X sub n? It's not very stable. Let me just say it's somewhat stable, but it's also very small. And I'll refer you back to that pie chart in the text where it talks about the contribution of all these terms, C, I, G, X sub n. It's a really small little sliver of pie. It's not even a piece of pie, it's a sliver, but it's very small. It really is very small. And people were once concerned about the idea that this was growing, and maybe the depths of that is the shortfall in exports in relation to imports. And their concern was, hey, it's going to get so big, it's going to drag the economy down and we're more reliant upon foreign sellers who could try to tap off, et cetera. We've definitely heard that discussion with regard to oil for the last part of 50 years. But for the most part, this is not something that a lot of people spend a lot of time awake all night worrying about, to the extent that people do worry about these things. Okay, so this is somewhat stable, but very small. Somewhat stable, very small. Okay. All right, so that does it for the expenditures approach. And I had hoped to get through the income approach, but we had about a 20-minute delay due to technical issues, and so I do apologize for that. So, by the way, I just want to reiterate for anybody who picked up is looking at this on the YouTube link, which is probably most of you. It's not going to be as long. So, you might be saying, hey, where's the rest of it? There's no rest of it. It's about 55 minutes. And so just because we couldn't get the projector to work, couldn't get the camera to work, we couldn't get a lot of stuff to work. Nothing was really working here. So it took the AV guy 2 visits. And so it's not going to be, so I'm probably not going to get to everything I wanted to get to the income approach today, but it is what it is. Okay. I think there are other things to worry about besides that. So what I'll do in the remaining, we have about 12 minutes left, is talk about the income approach and what it's about. Okay. And then I'll get into some of the data, and hopefully on Tuesday, I can actually get you, because I had told the class I would show you what the actual accounts look like, what these values are. And so we don't really have too much time to do that today, but let's talk about the income approach. The income approach is the measurement of GDP from the supply side of the economy. And that is, if the expenditures approach, which is what we just talked about, the C plus I plus G, if that's the demand side of the economy, this is the supply side of the economy, including, by the way, this idea of working our way down to the household level. And that's really the direction that we're going here, is working our way down to the household level. And I guess I could probably put some of this together right now for you and describe how that works. And so there's a couple of different things to know about this. One, the expenditures approach is one side of the economy. It's the demand side of the macro economy. The income approach is the supply side of the economy. So, but they both have to equal each other. If GDP equals one value in the expenditures approach, it's got to equal the same value in the income approach. And the reason why is they have to equal, because it doesn't make sense that they cannot equal. So let's talk a bit about what this looks like then from the income approach, and then we'll get into some of the actual numbers. We'll defer that discussion until Tuesday. We'll get into some of the numbers. And so let's talk about what the income approach is. So here we're gonna start from the top, and unlike the expenditures approach where we went horizontally across the board, we're gonna go vertically here, just because it's easier to sort of sort these out. Because what we're actually doing is we are working our way down to the household level. Okay, so this is the supply side. The expenditures approach is who's doing the spending. This is who's doing the receiving. So it's the supply side of the macro economy. And the term macro economy is simply the term that's used to describe the broader economy. Any broader economy, ours, the British economy, the Mexican economy, whatever. Okay, so we start with the same GDP as we did over there, where GDP on the expenditures approach is the same GDP here. Okay, so that's the first thing we start with. And the two have to equal each other. And if they don't equal, they're made to. And then, and one other thing I should mention is that I'm going to be cutting out a lot of categories on this, and maybe some of these will be in different orders than what you might see it if you're sort of, looking around on the internet, because there are lots and lots of different line items that I'm cutting out. And even on the expenditures approach, I mean, if you sort of tear into the numbers, you'll see it just like even something like construction, where you'll get single family, you'll get multifamily, 1 to 4 units, single family detached, single family attached. I mean, it slices and dices, and I'm going to be doing that here. I'm not going to slice and dice. I'm going to give you broad categories. And so if it looks like I'm cutting some things out, I'm doing it so that we don't have a list that just goes on from here to the moon, okay? Because it gets fairly broad. So let's start with GDP, total output of goods and services in the economy. It's somebody's doing the spending, somebody's got to be doing the receiving. So let's work our way down from the entire pie that is the economy to businesses. Government gets a share of this, and households get a share. So all these actors get a share. So let's work our way down. Well, the first thing we have to do is take out, there's a very technical adjustment that has to be made, but it's something called consumption of fixed capital. In other words, for anybody who's had accounting before, we call that depreciation. And that is, we produce goods, maybe we produce the goods in January, but by the end of the year, they're not worth as much. Or we produce goods in July, they're not worth as much by the end of the year. And that's simply what we call depreciation. It's simply a wearing out of the value. Anybody who's bought a new car knows this phenomenon. You buy a new car, and the millisecond you drive off the lot, it loses value just simply because it's no longer new. So those things that become new wear out, and so we have to take this depreciation into account. And it's simply wearing out of goods. Even houses wear out. And I know that sometimes people get the idea that I buy a house, it's going to go up in value over time. But real estate appraisers will tell you that houses also depreciate. It's just that, does the depreciation value catch up with the appreciation of the market value? That's what the trick is here. Okay, but we have to understand all these goods have a physical nature. If they have a physical nature, they're going to depreciate. So we take that out, and we arrive at something called net domestic product. And that's simply after taking that adjustment into account, net domestic product. Okay. Also, one thing that we should mention as well is that, and I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but you might come across a term called gross national product, which is sort of an old school term. We don't really use that very much, but was used for many decades. But if we're talking about the U.S. economy, what it really meant was the output and income of all Americans everywhere. And that was sufficient in order for us to understand, who's doing what. But the problem is that so many Americans are doing business overseas, and so many foreign entities are doing business here, that it's what's going on here within our borders. And so we no longer really make that sort of calculation, okay? In fact, if we take out what's called net foreign factor income, we arrive at this gross national product figure. Net foreign factor income is the idea that we take out the income of foreign firms and people, and we add in. Well, actually, so let's say Madonna, who's a U.S. actor, if she does a concert in England, for instance, it would go into gross national product. We have to add that back in, even though in domestic product terms, it's a function of that value is earned in Britain, so it goes in the British economy. Likewise, a company like Howard Johnson's, which is a British-owned hotel chain, we would take them out of gross domestic product and dump that back into the gross national product of Britain, okay? And I don't want to belabor the point, but I just want to make clear, because sometimes people run into GNP and say, what in the world is that? We really don't care that much about this. We really care about this because we're concerned, we're not so concerned about the nationality, the national identity of a firm or an individual who's doing business. So it doesn't even matter if a firm is doing business illegally here or if workers are not here with the proper documentation. It doesn't make any difference. If you're a worker, your wages will go into gross domestic product, regardless of that national identity. GNP is primarily useful mostly as a tax issue. And that is, Americans, for instance, are taxed on worldwide income. And that's more of an enforcement issue than it is a tracking issue, which is what we're interested in here. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now let's do a couple of things here. Well, we got a plus or minus. So it could go either way. We said the GDP here must equal GDP over there. Expenditure side. Well, what if it doesn't equal each other? Well, it's made to equal each other. And so we have something called a statistical discrepancy. So in other words, what are we doing here? We're fudging, aren't we? We're making the numbers balance. We're forcing them to balance. And the reason we're forcing them to balance is because they have to equal each other. It doesn't make sense. If my spending is your income, your spending is my income, and it's not just you individually, it's everybody in the economy, we're all interrelated. Well, they've got to equal each other because it doesn't make logical sense that they cannot. But yet we don't have perfect measurement of all of these activities. And we talked a little bit on Tuesday about the fact that there are some activities that we're really never going to have very good visibility into. So things like illegal activities. We just don't really have a very good fix on who's earning what from the stolen auto industry or bootleg cigarettes or the drug trade, all those things, the illegal drug trade, I should say. All those things are difficult to get a fix on. So as a result, we've got to make this number balance. Now, the good news is this is not a gigantic figure. I mean, it's not like huge percentage points of the economy. It's small, which is the good news, that it's not that large, but it's meant to balance each other. So it's a statistical discrepancy. Okay. Taking that into account, that we arrive at a value called national income. National income is basically business income. It's basically business income. And primarily business income is dominated primarily by corporations. And that when we talk about that firms, that big block in the circuit flow model firms, we're really talking primarily about corporations. Now, does this mean that other forms of business ownership like partnerships and sole proprietorships aren't important? No. In fact, there are lots and lots of sole proprietorships, but primarily they're considered mostly household businesses. There are some exceptions. There definitely are some exceptions. You don't have to operate from home, but you do pay taxes on your individual tax return. So they really are considered to be an extension of you as an individual who just happens to have some sort of business. And that could be a very large or the only source of your income. So primarily, we're talking about national income as being primarily corporate income. And we talk about corporate income because the corporation is really the dominant form of business ownership in the country. It's not the most numerous because there are lots and lots of sole proprietorships running around. Basically, one individual running a firm, and they could be, some of them are very large, but they pale in comparison to the economic contribution, the GDP from corporations. So national income is primarily corporate income. Then we take some things out. I've only got a couple minutes here. I'm going to sort of cut this off here in a minute because we're out of time. We're going to take out taxes. We're going to have, so we now have the businesses taking their share of this pie. So now we're going to take out import taxes, also known as tariffs. That is, we produce some goods come in, but they're taxed. And so some of that goes off to fund the government. And then we take out Social Security taxes. We're working our way down to the individual here. By the way, Social Security taxes are, and Medicare for that matter, are a unique form of tax in the sense that they're paid by companies in their role as employers, and they're also split evenly between the employer and employee. Even Steven, right down the line. Social Security taxes will stop at a certain dollar amount of income. So both the individual worker, that is, and the employer will stop paying tax. Medicare goes on and on and on for however much earned income you have. So we take Social Security taxes out, and by Social Security taxes, I mean some other taxes as well. And so we're about out of time, really. So I think I'm going to stop there. And it's not a great stopping point, but it's sort of where we are. When we come back on Tuesday, we're going to finish this discussion of the income approach. I'll show you some of the numbers from the BEA website that shows you how we arrive at and what the size of these numbers are. These are big, big, big numbers. And I'll give you a bit of an analysis of what the trends have been over time, because this data goes back to at least the 1920s in the accounts. And again, it's only been since around 1940 that the numbers are pretty reliable. So some of these are guesstimates at best, but I do want to give you a bit of a sense for that. And then we're going to talk about why GDP has got issues in terms of its measurement of why we're doing what we're doing, that is trying to live good lives. It may not really capture standard of living. So questions for me before we put a cap on today's activities? Okay, well, I will post this video, and otherwise have a great weekend, and I'll see you all on Tuesday. Okay, you too, bye-bye.